Good morning and welcome to this, the 23rd meeting of 2014, the second meeting of 2014. Of the European and External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that mobile phones are switched off? For some members using Kindles to make reference to the Scotland's Future document, and happy to allow that to continue. We have apologies from Jamie McGregor, who we believe is making a recovery, so we'll be glad to see him back soon. But in his place today is very capable Gavin Brown. Welcome, Gavin, to committee. Can I also welcome for the first time to the big table Dr Daniel Keneally, who is an advisor to the committee on its inquiry into the aspects of Scottish Government's White Paper in Scotland and Europe. Welcome, Dan. Agenda item 1 is moving on very swiftly, and I know that I've not given you time this morning for an opening statement, but I'll just do the formal welcomes and we'll sort of go straight into questions, if that's okay. Yep, so our first item on the agenda is the committee inquiry into Scottish Government's proposals for an independent Scotland and its membership of the European Union. And we have 2 evidence sessions today, and this is the first of those evidence sessions. And can I welcome back to committee, I believe, David Crawley, who is a former civil servant and lots of other titles that we've not got time to go into this morning, David. Professor Laura Cram, who is Professor of European Politics at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Laura. Dr Paolo Dardanelli, who is the Senior Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the University of Kent. Welcome to Scotland, Mr Dardanelli. And Professor John Bachtler, Director of the European Policies Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde. Welcome to you all. We are delighted to have you here this morning. We've got many questions for you, if you'll not be surprised. But I'm going to open with a sort of a general one to start with and get your opinion on that. And that really is just about, is membership of the European Union in the best interests of Scotland? And if you just, jump in and... Yeah, on you go.
In simply because in the note that I put in, I made it very clear, I think, that I thought that it was. And that seems to me to be for a range of economic, social and cultural reasons. I would not disagree with the view that what I've said is equally true for the United Kingdom as a whole. I would be extremely disturbed if the UK were to leave the EU, and I would be extremely disturbed if an independent Scotland found itself unwilling or unable to join it. And I hope that that would not happen. So I'll start that as a statement and pass on to others.
Thank you.
I agree with the comments that we've seen in the written evidence that membership is, in the current context, in the benefits of Scotland. In Dr Dardanelli's paper, we see a lot on the importance of that changing context, and some of the things that I've been looking at on public attitudes particularly, I think, are very contingent on the changing context. But I would also, I think, emphasise in this context that whether or not, or whatever process it takes to get there, we're likely to see much more continuity than radical change. It's a long and slow machine with great adaptability. So I think we could keep that note of caution in any discussions on EU membership.
Yes, thank you. Well, as I put in the paper, I mean, broadly speaking, I agree with my colleagues, and I just would like to emphasise the dynamic nature of the subject that we are looking at. So there are many uncertainties there. They might change the picture quite significantly. And if I may add, I think there is a sort of tension there between sort of the desire that transpires from the document of the government to be at the heart of Europe, in a sense, and the path that there's been set for Scotland to follow what the UK has done in terms of semi-detached membership. And I think there is a tension there that will have to be resolved in one way or another.
Yes, thank you. I really don't have anything to add. I would agree with what the previous speakers have said, and particularly in, as Paolo has said in his paper, the alternatives to membership. There are alternatives to membership if possible, but they're all suboptimal.
Our second panel today is from EFTA, so we've got some interesting information to come from that today. I'm happy to go straight to open questions if members are willing. Hanzala.
Yeah, David is very keen to jump in, and that's very encouraging. However, David, I wonder if you could tell me, there's no guarantee of membership. unless you can cite some evidence that there is,
No,
before we start jumping into things.
Yes, forgive me, I was only wanting to, as it were, start the ball rolling. No, there is no guarantee that what we might wish can actually happen. I think it is important and essential in all this debate to recognise that what would be created following a yes vote in the referendum would be, in European terms, an unprecedented situation, namely a part of a member state seceding and wishing to become a full member state of the EU. I do not think that such a conclusion would surprise anybody around the EU, and I do think that in very broad terms, the institutions of the EU, Commission, Parliament, and for the most part, the Council, would want to see Scotland be a full member of the European Union. What it is impossible to do is to guarantee either that that outcome would happen, or I think even more particularly that it would happen within any specific timescale. And for me, it is in many respects the timescale which is of greater concern than the final outcome.
Interesting. As a Scot, obviously, I want to be a part of the European Union, whether as a British member or a Scottish member. And I think that's exactly the concern that I have, is that one, we're not guaranteed a seat at the top table, as many of us put it, and two, the time scale that would involve and what's the implications of that. And I'm just wondering, erring on caution, to say that even if we were to have a yes vote, and even if we did apply for the European Union, how big a part are we going to be of Europe, considering we are a 5 million population, and we are in fact on the very edge of the European Union? How does that place us economically? How strong would we be, and what are the implications in terms of renegotiation into entry? Would we be looking at giving more concessions that perhaps some of the other members have historically to achieve that?
I think others might want to comment on the comparative position. I don't think that in itself being a small member state is necessarily always a bad thing. It depends what the small member state wants, whether it can ally itself with other people, and how it, as it were, deals with the whole European concept. In the note that I've given, I think I've given some suggestions as to how small states have characteristically done quite well for themselves, the massively important.
We are now in new territory.
Absolutely, and that's part. It's a European Union of 27, probably soon 28 member states. So it isn't ever going to be easy. It will require a significant investment of resources. If you were to ask me whether I would rather be a citizen of a large member state in terms of achieving European objectives within Europe, I would have to say, well, probably yes, because clearly, as far as voting weights are concerned and as far as major influence is concerned, you only have to look at what Germany can achieve and the role that it has taken to see the difference in scale of influence. But it's not necessarily going to be a bad thing for an independent Scotland to... It's not going to be necessarily going to be difficult for an independent Scotland to survive with a degree of prosperity in a larger Europe, as long as it can manage to ally its interest with others and put a lot of effort into the whole process. Others will have more to add, I suspect.
Thank you. Can I go back to the first part of your question? I think it might be helpful to recall what the process is for a member state to, or an applicant country to become a member state, because it involves a number of stages. The first is the European Commission judging whether the applicant fulfills some basic criteria in having the institution to uphold the rule of law, democratic society, functioning market economy, guaranteeing human rights. And at that point, the applicant country formally has the status of an applicant state. Now, it's very difficult to see Scotland not being accorded that. The problems are likely to arise in the second part of the next part of the process, which becomes quasi-political, quasi-administrative, in the sense that there is the Council decides to open negotiations, and the European Commission undertakes a screening process across the 30-35 chapters of the acquis, which then each of those has to be signed off, if you like, agreed by the Council, and then one can proceed to an accession treaty. Now, that's assuming that there isn't a shortcut, which the Independence White Paper says could be an alternative. So I think it's almost inconceivable that Scotland wouldn't be accorded the status of applicant state. The question is under what terms Scotland would become eventually a member state, and how long it would take. We can perhaps talk more about the timetable, but just to address the first part of your question.
Just to follow up on that, in terms of fast-tracking any membership, I mean, you'll appreciate that regardless of what Scotland's position is, I mean, it is taken for granted that Scotland will qualify to become a member of the European Union. And that worries me slightly, because it only takes one EU state to say, no, we don't want Scotland to be a member, and that just rules us out. So that's a concern, because in the absence of anybody, the European Union's actually considering membership before the referendum means we don't know, it's a non-known identity. So what do you see in terms of reducing the timetable? Is there a possibility of reducing timetables? Because at the moment, the way it looks, although the Scottish Government is under the impression that they can have the timetable in a very short period of time, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't look likely. What is your opinion about that in terms of the time scale? I think that's very important for us, because if, for example, there is a yes vote, how long would it be before we became members of the European Union, and what damage would that do us in terms of the time scaling, how long it takes, and how does that implement in our resources in terms of taxations and other issues?
Can I go on the timetable? I mean, I think it is right that there is a significant concern about the timetable. It is the fact that there is no precedent and no clear formulation within the treaties which provides for this situation, and that if Scotland is to proceed in a way different from that which applies to normal accession states, something new would have to be invented and agreed, is what makes an initial very significant difficulty. If Scotland were to proceed on the basis of the current accession articles, then it is, I think, quite clear that the timescale would be very significantly longer than the 18 months which would be allowed between the referendum and March 2016. In either event, there is really quite a complex set of processes which would need to be gone through. It seems to me to be highly unlikely that they will start on the 19th of September 2014. That is partly because the negotiator on Scotland's behalf at that stage will be the United Kingdom government, and that will remain the case until Scotland actually becomes independent. So that is an issue in itself, particularly given the complication of the 2015 general election. Other issues are that one of the first things that will have to happen is that whatever the legal basis in the end is decided to be, there will have to be the detailed analysis which John has just referred to, taking place by the Commission, because whatever the basis, the Commission will have to produce a very detailed and lengthy assessment which will have to go into Council before, in a sense, before really serious discussions can start. I don't see that being realistic. It being realistic to expect that to be before the Council, much before mid-2015. I don't know that, but I think that that would be very, very likely in terms of timescale. I mean, I have had quite a lot of experience at the pace at which the Commission will move with such things. Of course, if this were a European-wide crisis, then that might be another matter. But we have to recognise that Scotland will be the interceding party in all of this, and therefore it is quite difficult, going to be quite difficult to ramp up the accelerator. If I wanted to ramp up the accelerator, what I would want to try to do would be to get the first European Council of Heads of State meeting after the referendum to agree a complex and probably extensive declaration which would, in a sense, reach a view on what the legal process, on what the legal basis was, and set out a process and a time scale for how to deal with it. I don't know whether that time scale could conceivably be done within the time period. I still doubt it. But that would be the way to try to accelerate matters as far as one possibly could. It doesn't seem to me to be that likely, though, in the way in which the Council works, that one would get a resolution of the basic legal issues within the sort of September to December time frame that I'm thinking about. And I would come back to the point that I refer to in the paper, which is that I do think it's interesting that people have looked at the range of different legal bases, and I know you're going to be hearing more about that, I think, next week. But in the end of the day, in terms of getting the Commission and the Council to move, those legal bases are going to have to be agreed by the Council and the Commission legal services. Without their advice, it really is very, very hard to see this moving forward. The other timetable issue, just to bear in mind, is that there will be an involvement from the Parliament, and I can't honestly say exactly how, where, and when that involvement would take place, the European Parliament, I mean. And that also is going to take time. So when you look at the series of iterations which are liable to take place, I have to say I do find the 18 months timetable unrealistic. Thank you.
Can I think we should actually hear from the rest of the panel, but Mr. Crawley, you had said that the Commission and all the key players would need to invent something new, and that agreed. Is the European Union not synonymous for inventing something new to meet certain sets of circumstances, and that's generally agreed very, very quickly? And the other thing about timescale is, in the last big enlargement, the whole process took 13 months. So is that really, you know, a timescale where you said you think 18 months is unrealistic for all of those other countries where they did have to go through all the chapters? It took 13 months, so...
Yes, I take that point. I mean, I think it's perfectly true that the European Union can invent things. It really has to. In general, though, it takes quite a long time for it to invent things, and it is a different matter discussing the position of this one potential member state against that of the several member states who joined the EU fairly soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of that. As I think I said in my note, what would help Scotland a lot in this and in other things is that if it is able to move forward upon a large European tide, I mean, that's the kind of a major political event, can move things along more quickly. Although, as we have seen in the period after the 2008 and continuing Eurozone crisis, the decisions to actually deal with that are not actually taken quickly. And where decisions are difficult, there is often a preference for avoiding them for as long as possible. If there is complete unanimity on what should be done, then, of course, it would become a little easier. We have a fair amount of evidence to suggest that complete unanimity will be a struggle. We've heard about we've heard the position of Spain. Whether that will change or not, I don't know. But what we do know is that it is a big item there to be dealt with, and it will take time. That is also true of the areas where Scotland may or may not want certain derogations from the standard framework of the European treaties. And I'm not making any particular view on whether it should or should not want these, but it is nevertheless the case that if Scotland wants to take on United Kingdom derogations, if it wants to take on, as it were, a share of the UK rebate, if it wants to develop special protections for Scottish fisheries, then these are going to be significant issues which will require time to negotiate and will, in a sense, discourage some of our European partners from wanting to hasten the whole thing along.
Yeah, I'd really like to hear from the other panel. I'm going to make a quick comment. I remember the UK opposing East Germany coming into Europe and it being resolved in the end very, very quickly.
Just an addendum.
Yes, of course.
To what David said, as far as I'm aware, the shortest period between a country applying for membership and becoming a member state was Finland, which was 3 years. And it was able to piggyback on the back of Austria and Sweden's negotiations. Many of the so-called new member states that joined in 2004, they had much longer periods, 14 years in the case of Cyprus and Malta. Now, a fair amount of that time, or most of that time, was because of lack of political agreement on when and how and under what terms the membership should take place. But just as a caveat to what David said.
Caveat in addition to that is that that's if we were an applicant new member state, whereas the proposal is that we wouldn't be, we'd be negotiating from within. Laura, I'd like to hear from both you and Dr Dardanelli and just on all the topics that was raised so that we can get a fair analysis. And I think, Willie, you're in with the next question.
This issue of timescale is very, very important, but one of the points that I wanted to make early on was that notion of continuity and a general preference for continuity within the EU machine. I think is what we've seen historically, that when there are transitions, although it's probably worth us distinguishing between, if you like, the process and the end point. So while we are talking about a lengthy period of time potentially until all the ends are tied up and a membership final agreement package is agreed, the notion that somehow Scotland would be out in the cold and floating in that interim period, even if it were to come entirely as an applicant state, I think would be considered fairly unusual in the EU context. The general approach has been to agree transition arrangements with various states in various different environments, and whether within or without the EU, and even without a history of EU membership, we've seen long and lengthy transition periods agreed, rather than people being either members or not members, just like that. And I think that's quite important, that notion that there would be a process probably in place, whatever way they were likely to do it. I think that the points that David Crawley made, particularly in his paper, about that generally that there is likely to be support for some kind of membership arrangement with Scotland, and that generally there's been a perception, often actually probably more in comparison to the rest of the UK than a real perception, but a perception that Scotland is relatively friendly towards the EU. And of course, in certain current circumstances, there may also be member states that see that as an advantage in this negotiation process. But it's also worth in this process of thinking that historically the moment of accession has been one of the most powerful moments for applicant states, and frequently what is lamented for applicant states is that post-application, once they are members, they never again are able to have quite the same influence as they do at the negotiation point. So I mean, we have very clear understanding that there was no guarantee of getting every position that you want, and that the negotiation process would be complex and challenging. But it is also a moment, if you are in the position of being an applicant state, where uniquely new member states have managed to gain things that they wouldn't have been able to do in other negotiating circumstances. And I think that's worth taking into account when we understand this process.
Dr Dardanelli.
Thank you. I totally agree with what David said. I mean, the fundamental issue seems to me that there is no legal framework for this. So this is entirely uncharted waters. We'll have to sort of, imagine as we go along. So I also agree that that is not likely to be done quickly. So very much on the same line. I mean, what I'd like to sort of emphasise, perhaps, is that, of course, an accession of an independent Scotland will be politically controversial. In a number of countries, I mean, Spain, one of those, but Romania, for example, and others. Scotland will find itself in a very different situation from the new member states that they've joined, where the issue was, are they fit for membership or not? What adjustment they need to go through? That obviously is not an issue with Scotland. So it's a very different set of issues that they are, of a sensitive political nature rather than sort of the practical side of things. And so that would be, we find itself in a very different situation from the new member states. I mean, in terms of the timetable itself, just to add, I mean, it seems to me that we need to think whether the process will be one of accession or a reframing of membership, also has already been said. And I mean, I personally find the reframing of membership not unreasonable as a scenario, because it would be also very problematic sort of to expel, in a sense, Scotland upon independence. So probably the course that the government has charted is, I don't find it an unreasonable one, but will be entirely based on political negotiations and on the agreement of the other member states. On the small countries, whether they can prosper in the EU, I would definitely say yes. I don't think there is any reason to worry. I mean, we have many other examples. If you take Denmark, for example, Finland, or Ireland. So there is absolutely no reason why a small country cannot do well in the EU. I mean, if anything, the EU is a system where small countries sort of punch above their weight because they are overrepresented in institutions. They are sort of treated almost as equals to the large member states, where, if you think of, traditional international relations, that was not the case. So, although obviously Germany and France and some other countries, they have a greater weight, then the small countries certainly do well. So the question, of course, this is perhaps beyond what the committee is considering today, but the question is whether Scotland would be in a better position as an independent member of the EU or as part of the UK. I guess it depends on how aligned the interests of Scotland are with those of the UK. Then, obviously, if there is a close alignment there, then be part of the UK, greater weight would be better. But then if the alignment is not there, then, of course, the UK will not be in a position to defend the interests of Scotland. Then Scotland would definitely be better off defending its own interests. So the question is that one. And we go back to perhaps the point I made before, whether the UK has charted a particular type of membership, whether Scotland wants to follow in the footsteps of the UK or change course. But changing course implies taking quite difficult decisions. For example, membership of the single currency and Schengen and so on.
Thank you. Willie Coffey.
To just pick up this point a little further, just for the benefit, I think, maybe of the public, perhaps watching this debate and trying to understand what we're all saying, could you clarify your opinion on September the 19th, the day after Scotland votes yes for independence? Is Scotland in the European Union, or are we out? Could you simply answer that just across the panel? What's the position? Are we in or out on September the 19th?
Scotland is in. September the 19th.
There's
no question about that. Scotland is in because...
Sorry, just could I quickly get an in-out? I don't want to turn it into a quiz show, but quickly, could you answer that? Because I want to follow up on that. Are we in or out?
I mean, as already been said, on the 19th, still in. But once the transition phase to independence takes place, then no one knows.
Yes, Professor.
Because it's not clear whether we'll find itself outside or not.
No, we're in.
Can I?
No, hold on. Could you just get this, please? Are we in or out on September?
My understanding is that as long as Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, then it's in.
We're in. So in the day after. So at what point then do those of you who feel that we would have to negotiate from outside? When do we become expelled from the European Union in that process? And what's the basis for that?
Well, the question would be that on the 31st of March or the 1st of April 2016, whenever it is that Scotland declares its independence, and that independence is recognised and legally based, Scotland as a state, and I emphasise as a state, will not be a signatory to the European treaties. In that sense, Scotland will not be a member of the European Union in that formal treaty sense. Scotland may well regard itself, and it may well be regarded as there in the European Union, but that in a formal sense it will not be a member because it will not at that stage be a signatory of the European treaties. Its path at that point will be that as an independent state, recognised in the UN or whatever, it will be perfectly entitled to seek membership of the European Union as a state.
Is there anything within the treaties that specifically state that 5 million citizens shall leave the European Union if they vote for independence? Is there anything that says that anywhere?
No.
No. Is there? Mr. Crawley?
Yes. We'll respond to the inference of your question.
Is there?
It is simply that in the end of the day, the European Union, and others will correct me if they feel I'm wrong, but the European Union is an organisation based on international treaty law. The treaties founding the European Union have conceded significant elements of sovereignty, but that in the end of the day, it is a treaty signed by states members. At the point when Scotland becomes independent, it will not be one of the states members who have signed it.
Is there anything within the treaties that clearly show that 5 million citizens who have been members of the European Union for 40 years shall automatically no longer be members? Is there anything?
Yes, to that I would answer, no, there isn't, and that actually is a substantial part of the problem that is faced.
Could I just hear what the other views are?
No, I mean, I have to agree with exactly that statement of it. There's, in a unique situation, you're having to negotiate unique circumstances. The notion of being expelled historically is a very unusual way to imagine the European Union working. Indeed, it wouldn't be a signatory state. We totally agree. The formal processes, and from the discussions on this, we know that for every lawyer you can find another tale of how we will, in fact, negotiate that membership. But the formal legal position won't be a head of state, that's signatory to those treaties, but the other part of the European Union is the informal structure that rumbles on, and the range of other arrangements that in reality mean that the reality that people live under is likely to be no different one day to the next, while the process is rumbling on and negotiations are made.
Dardanelli?
Again, as I said before, no, there is no legal basis. So for either option, either be expelled or remaining, there is no legal basis. So it's something, is entirely something that needs to be made up. And I mean, as the government suggested, using the article is possible, but is entirely based on political negotiations. And I imagine, as already been said, that if that reframing of membership rather than accession is the way that will be chosen, then the negotiation will have to take place in that period between September 2014 and spring 2016, so that on becoming independent will also be part of the European Union. But that is entirely, there are no guarantees there. There cannot be any guarantees there. It's entirely dependent on essentially the political will of the member states to agree to that.
I think it's all been said.
Sorry, I keep going from that way to this.
That's great.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, I've got Gavin and then Patricia.
Mr. Crawley, in your evidence, or your written evidence, paragraph 14, talking about the route to membership, you say, and I quote, "Even assuming a reasonably fair wind, the timetable suggested by the Scottish Government seems unrealistic." Quite interested to know, assuming there isn't, we don't have several member states doing everything they can to prevent Scotland joining, but on the other side we don't have a kind of collapse of the Berlin Wall moment that just catapults Scotland in. Assuming in the ordinary run of things, what is a real, and assuming we get in, which I share your view on that, what is a realistic timetable based on your knowledge and experience?
Thank you. I do find it very difficult to come up with a realistic timetable, partly because of everything that everybody has said about this being an unprecedented and unusual situation. I mean, the processes which take place if there is a major treaty change, from initial consideration to final result, have characteristically taken several years. I mean, that was true of Maastricht, and it was true of Amsterdam and some of the other treaties which have changed the character of the EU over the years. If this were to remain a one-issue which involved treaty change of some kind in some place, then you could certainly conceive of it taking place over a significantly shorter timescale than that. I do think that that's difficult. I mean, in my experience, one-issue treaty changes are quite unusual and quite hard to achieve, and you do have the problem of potential opposition. I do think that it's if I had to guess, and in a sense I'm unwilling to guess because I think it could be held against those of us, but I would just say my strongest guess is it'll take longer than 18 months, and that 2 to 3 years is much more realistic. That depends on, but so much depends on how much, if you can manage to get some real political steam behind it, and I don't mean noise and lots of stuff in the press. What I actually do mean is getting the UK government to put its absolute hardest energy behind all this. Then I can see a possibility that you could you'd work towards a European Council statement which gave the whole thing a serious political drive. In that case, I'd still be jolly surprised if it could be done in the timescale set out, but it might not take more than 6 months or so longer. That's about the best I can do.
I'm interested in other panellists' views as well, but maybe just to add on to that, assuming that central scenario were to play out, as you see, in paragraph 15 you say, in the absence of a clear timeline, your final sentence you say, I would expect that attention will need to turn sooner rather than later to interim arrangements needed to maintain Scotland's legal relationship with the EU until final decisions are taken. I just wonder if you and other panellists can expand on how would that work in practice? What are the complexities involved there, and how potentially tricky does that could that become?
Well, I think the complexities are quite significant, given that the same situation has not arisen before. But as Laura has said on a number of points in her evidence so far, the EU is generally quite good at a certain political adaptability, so it might well find ways of dealing with this. Another suggestion which I read from somebody yesterday was that, in effect, Scotland might actually be allowed some kind of status which meant that all the legal provisions of the EU continued to apply, even while it was not, in fact, a member of Council and had not been a formal signatory. In other words, it would be a bit like a member of the European Economic Area for a period. But that's the kind of thing I think people would have to be working towards.
Have comments on either of those two sort of questions?
Patricia.
Thank you, Convener. I really just wanted to ask a supplementary that I think arises out of the line of questioning that Willie and Gavin have been looking at. And good morning, sorry, I'm very impolite there. And that is, at this notional point that we come to sometime in March 2016 or April 2016, would we have MEPs?
Fascinating question, actually. I don't think any of us know the answer. I mean, at the point when Scotland ceases to become part of the United Kingdom, the UK's population share of the EU will drop. The rest of the UK, that is. It would follow that the rest of the UK would only have a smaller number of MPs, and I imagine there would be an issue over whether Scotland's MEPs should still attend the Parliament. That's something that would require quite tricky negotiation within the UK and between the UK and the rest of the EU. It's an interesting example, actually, of one of the questions which the rest of the UK would face and would have to seek to agree at an EU level as a result of the change in its population, if nothing else.
It will require a change in the treaty anyway, in a sense.
At that point, we would not be formal signatories to the treaty. Therefore, potentially that could
complicate matters?
No, at that point, assuming that there was no formal treaty at that stage, then as far as the rest of the UK is concerned, and I'm kind of constructing this as I go, but as far as the rest of the UK is concerned, then the existing treaties would continue to apply, and it would still have the same number of MPs until the treaty changed. So whether or not Scotland's MPs could still legitimately attend the European Parliament on some basis or another would presumably be something that would need to be agreed between the new Scottish Government and the UK Government. But as I say, that is a little bit of a construction on a premise.
So. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. There's been a bit of discussion about the diverging interests of the UK and Scotland, and Convener mentioned the fisheries being expendable in the past, and the recent cap payment would suggest that there maybe is quite a bit of divergence there. But I really want to, sort of the elephant in the room of all of this is that we haven't talked about possible UK referendum and an out membership of the EU. So I would really like to ask the panel if they have any evidence and what's their opinion on the attitude of the Scottish people towards the European Union, and do they think that the Scottish people have a more pro-European attitude than the rest of the UK?
You've got very useful figures in the Spice paper, actually, on the latest poll data on Scotland and the UK. I think when you're talking about this, context is absolutely key, and talking about it also in the context of that referendum is likely to shift that and concentrate, perhaps, those responses. It's probably safer to say, if you contextualise those figures, that Scotland is maybe less anti-EU than the data is showing for England, because once you start to contextualise those figures with European figures, the rest of the UK, the whole of the UK, remains at 42%, the lowest of the EU states, along with Greece, given its current circumstances, to feel that their citizens, to feel that they are members of the European Union, that they're citizens of the European Union. So it's worth contextualising that. Within the context of the UK, there's evidence that the Scots electorate is slightly more pro-EU. But within the EU context, the notion that Scotland is particularly Europhile shouldn't necessarily be overstressed. It's also interesting to really look at that in context, because it changes, and you'll actually see the figures that are in the Spice paper, I think they're on page 12, are quite interesting in that context. In exactly the same poll, you've got 53% of Scots that say they would vote to stay in the European Union in a referendum. But if you also look in the same poll, 61% say that an independent Scotland should be part of the EU. So immediately the context of whether they're in an independent Scotland or whether they're part of the rest of the UK makes a difference to their responses. So I think in terms of whether or not we can say Scots are pro-EU, a lot depends on the context, and a lot depends on what happens when push actually comes to shove. If you actually take what happened, for example, in Greece, where you have the highest rates of saying that the EU is rising rates of saying EU is a bad thing, sort of instrumentally. You've got the lowest rates of saying that you feel like an EU citizen. You still continually vote to stay in the EU and accept the packages, and the public opinion polls say that about 75% of people want to stay in the EU or be part of the euro. So I think we really do have to sort of measure these very carefully and assume that a change in the UK position in the referendum, or the reality of actually coming to a vote, might actually change what we're seeing on the data. So we should neither overestimate on the basis of what's in the figures, nor underestimate the actual attachment that might be there if you see it as being a threat in real life.
Well, I think I would just comment on this issue, and I agree that it is fundamental. I mean, there will be, to say the least of it, a massive problem for an independent Scotland if in 2017 the rest of the UK actually does have a referendum, and if the outcome of that referendum is a rest of the UK decision to leave the EU. I find it quite difficult to understand what the implications of that problem are going to be, but it is fairly clear, at least it is clear, that many of the arrangements which will be comfortable within the British Isles will be rather difficult to achieve if the rest of the UK is out of the EU and Scotland is in it. That doesn't mean to say that I think it would necessarily be wrong for Scotland to be in the EU at that stage, but I do think a very, very serious analysis of that situation will need to take place.
Excuse me,
Mr. Crawley, are you suggesting that if the UK votes to leave the EU, and that potentially becomes a problem for Scotland? I don't understand why that would be a problem for Scotland, but I'm thinking, is it a problem for Scotland because of the EU trade agreements? Are you suggesting that the UK not only would be out of Europe, but would be out of the economic area as well?
Yes, I think who knows the answer to that question, but the UK will, at least in certain respects, will be a third country. It will not be a member of the EU, and that certainly raises quite significant questions about customs, travel, immigration, trade, transport. There's a whole lot of things which would be an issue. It's not to say they can't be resolved. Look at Switzerland, for example. But they do create quite a significant set of problems. And given that Scotland's trading relationships with the rest of the UK are very, very significant, that I think could be difficult from an economic point of view.
I think I'll do a wee bit more research on that, but I think that's the first time I've heard anybody suggest that the UK would take themselves out of the EU economic area as far as trade would go, and I find that quite astonishing, actually.
I'm not suggesting that that is what will happen. What I am suggesting is that a UK decision to leave the EU will create a very significant series of uncertainties which will then have to be resolved. I think that Paolo's evidence touches on that point as well.
Kind of following through from that last thread, my understanding is that if the Conservative Party is re-elected on a platform of negotiating, it will put the outcome of those negotiations to a referendum in 2017, which is obviously after the 31st of March 2016. What I really wanted to know from you, and I appreciate it's a matter of speculation, is what impact would negotiations for Scotland's entry into the EU have if at the same time there are parallel negotiations with the UK government on terms, as it were, that they want to put to a referendum in 2017? The pros and cons to kind of parallel negotiations going on?
No, I mean, probably as we suggested earlier, the negotiation might not be parallel in the sense that if Scotland succeeds in sort of reframing, Scotland and the rest of the UK succeeds in reframing membership rather than going for accession, that will have taken place already by the spring 2016. So then the issue would just be for the rest of the UK in 2017 to decide whether to stay in or not. Then if that's not the case, and the process is one of accession, then obviously the two would overlap. But in that case, again, will be sort of simply two different processes going on at the same time, which I can't see sort of too many linkages.
Just an additional point or additional scenario, if you like. When the UK government is conducting a balance of competences review at the moment, and if you like, one of the more likely scenarios is perhaps that the UK is seeking to renegotiate some parts of its treaty obligations, and that while some commentators have said it's unlikely that other member states would be willing to agree to a sort of pick and mix approach to member state obligations, there is the possibility that the number of opt-outs or derogations or special arrangements for the UK might increase, which in some cases may have implications for Scotland's position in terms of the negotiations for membership.
It is likely to be something of a kaleidoscope, I'm afraid. I think one would have to hope, as Paolo says, that whatever negotiations were in the end required for Scotland to become a full member would take place at least before a UK referendum took place. But meanwhile, negotiations would take place on the kind of changes that the UK wants. And I don't think one should underestimate the extent to which the EU as a whole would actually want to shift a bit to keep the UK in, as long as what the UK wants is consistent with what a reasonable number of other member states want. And neither do I think, as Laura says, one should underestimate the likelihood that when push comes to shove, the position of the UK electorate would be rather different from what it looks like in the polls at the moment. So these are risks. These are all risks that will have to be taken if we come to this situation.
Okay, Patricia.
Convener. As you know, the Scottish Government has suggested that Article 48 would be its preferred route in. A lot of what I hear in Europe is that other member states, other people involved in Europe think that actually Article 49 still applies. What do you think is the likely balance of opinion as to which of those scenarios is the one that's most going to be favoured in Europe?
At the moment, I would have to say Article 49. That does seem to be the most likely position. But I know that there are other arguments, and I think it will be very interesting for you as a committee to hear David Edward on this subject next week, and he's somebody for whose views one can only have the highest possible respect. It still leaves one in the situation that there is going to be need to be a movement in European legal opinion in order to back that approach.
Well, perhaps just again to say that more than a legal issue is a political issue, seems to me. And politically, of course, the positions are very different across Europe, so we cannot sort of identify a prevailing position. Or perhaps we can, but then sort of what is not in the prevailing position is still very significant. And certainly countries as I said, such as Spain or Romania or even Belgium might take a very firm position on this, as opposed to, let's say, Denmark or Sweden or Ireland. And so how that will play out is very difficult to predict.
Again, the Scottish Government's position would be that it would wish to retain Schengen opt-outs in other areas, about free travel, about the rebate. How much of a barrier would those be to negotiation for Scotland?
I don't think anybody would be the slightest bit surprised or particularly concerned if the Scottish Government wished to retain the Schengen opt-out, because that is consistent with the position that Ireland currently has. I think the difficulties are, from what I know at the moment, of the kind of positions that the Scottish Government might take, which is just a result of reading the White Paper and the subsequent paper, I would have said that the most difficult areas are going to be fisheries and the rebate. I doubt if I think some kind of amendment to the position on justice and home affairs is something that the Scottish Government would also seek, so that at least for the time being it could continue with the position that it's held as part of the UK, and which it has actually been quite a full participant in forming. But equally, I think it might well be possible that the Scottish Government would want in the end to kind of adjust its position on justice and home affairs issues. But the difficult ones seem to me at the moment, at any rate, to be about fisheries and the rebate. That is, of course, there may well be opt-outs turning up in the kind of negotiations that the UK government may seek, which would further complicate the position. But as things stand, I think that's the view I would take.
Just on the rebate, I think it's very difficult to see a scenario where other member states would agree to a replication of the rebate because the UK is constantly isolated in almost every budget negotiations. More reasonable would be for Scotland to benefit from the kind what are called generalised correction mechanisms that Austria, Netherlands, Germany benefit from, but which don't have a permanent status. They have to be renegotiated every 7 years. That's on that particular issue. That's perhaps the most likely scenario.
I noticed in Mr. Crawley's paper that too many doctors and professors to leave you out, Mr. Crawley, that you suggested that in order to be a full participating member of the EU, Scotland would really have to resource up, in a sense, and would have to consider very carefully what that would actually mean. I wondered if any of the panel had any thoughts, even if they're preliminary thoughts, about what that would actually look like in practice.
My point, and I do with slightly nervously recall an exchange on this the last time I appeared before this committee, so I hope that Mr. Malik in particular will forgive me for restating something that we said then. My point is that if you're going to deal in depth and in detail in the European Union and take on the full responsibilities of a member state and carry out all the work that you need to do in terms of diplomacy, of regular engagement in Brussels with working groups, and looking at what member states of all different sizes have done and what they have achieved, it seems clear to me that to be an effective member of the kind that I know that Scotland would want to be, we Scotland, will need a significant extension and development of expertise in a whole range of areas, including particularly in areas where Scotland does not currently have, as it were, domestic devolved competence, even in some of those domestic areas where, in a sense, our expertise has piggybacked to a certain extent on the expertise available to the UK government, we would need to develop that. I can't put any figures on that, but that's going to be a very important area of development. And attracting expertise of the kind that can have status and carry weight within commission working groups and all of that kind of organisation is actually, it's challenging. It's not, I'm not saying it's not doable, but it's something that will have to be recognised, as will be the need for a very significant extension of the kind of representation at a civil servant and political level that we have in Brussels. I mean, I was, as you know, head of the Scotland Representative Office in Brussels from 2005 to 2006 during the last UK presidency, and it's very nice and it's been extremely useful. It's been very valuable that it's been there and within the diplomatic framework in Brussels, but it wouldn't cut it as a national representation, absolutely not. You would need to have significant increase in staff in Brussels, and there would also, you also do need to bear in mind the need to carry out a fair amount of diplomatic work around the European Union. So that's quite a big chunk of extra resource that would be required. And that's apart from whoever you might require back here to back this kind of work.
Do you want to comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, a couple of supplementaries. I've got Claire Adamson and then Rod Campbell.
Yes, we've talked a lot about unprecedented situations and the uniqueness of where we find ourselves. But in relation to how other EU states might view Scottish independence, does the Edinburgh Agreement not put us in a completely unique position in that we have the agreement of the UK government that they will, facilitate and abide by the democratic will of the Scottish people? And in effect, does that Edinburgh Agreement not, in the negotiation period to independence, put an onus on the UK government to do everything it can to negotiate the position of Scotland in Europe?
I'm tempted to say that that's a question only the ministers of the UK government can conceivably answer, quite frankly. The truth is that that is a very important agreement, clearly, and it is governing relations up to and including the referendum, and it certainly will significantly influence the attitude taken after the referendum in the event of a yes vote. What that actually means in terms of determining the UK's precise positions and the time it will take to do it is quite another matter. And, I mean, beyond the referendum, inevitably the UK government will have two faces. I mean, it will have a face which is which is necessarily and democratically required to maintain in the interests of the population of the rest of the United Kingdom, as well as the face which, as it were, is trying to carry through the spirit of that agreement. How that will play out in terms of UK politics throughout 2014, 15, 16, I think is one of the great unknowns of this whole process, especially given the possibility of a UK, the fact of a UK election in mid-2015.
I think that would be a standard political scientist position, that how life is breathed into the document of the agreement is where the devil lies.
One final quick question, Convener. My understanding, based on the more detailed document about Scotland's position in Europe, that if by using Article 48, we talked about the continuity of effect in Europe, that actually things like the rebate aren't designed to be permanent positions for Scotland, but positions to allow continuity on entry, but that would be negotiated again at the next round of negotiations. Is my position? Have I understood that wrongly?
Well, I think it's what the Scottish Government has concluded would be the case. They're perfectly entitled to conclude that. It will remain an issue for negotiation, and I don't think it can be guaranteed or assumed.
Okay,
Just going back a bit slightly to the Schengen Agreement, we heard from Professor Keating on the 5th of December that remaining outside Schengen and in the single travel area would be a lot easier to negotiate than getting into Schengen. Does anybody on the panel disagree with that?
Not really, no. I don't, because I think in order to get into Schengen, you have to meet certain conditions anyway. It might be, in general, an accession state would be assumed to join Schengen in due course, but only once a series of conditions were actually met, and that could take a very long time in the case of some new member states. So, no, I mean, I think if Scotland wanted to have, as it were, common travel arrangements within the UK, it really doesn't have any option. It's actually got to keep out of Schengen.
In relation to Articles 48 and 49, I think, Mr Crawley, in your written submission, you said you're not convinced that the actual basis should make all that much difference. Would you expand on that?
I'm sometimes given to slightly blunt statements, and that was probably one of them. But it doesn't mean to say I disagree with myself. I mean, I do actually think that given the points that some of us have made here this morning about a broad sense of goodwill, ways may be found. But to me, that isn't, and as I said at the beginning, that isn't entirely the point. The point is that whether you choose Article 48 or 49, it is a new situation. And whether you support the one option or the other, you have a new situation, and you have to find a way, and you're going to have to get legal support for it, you're going to have to get council support, parliament support, and so on and so on. And in the end of the day, the substance of the process, which would involve serious analysis by the Commission to start with of the state of the legal framework within Scotland and a range of other issues, plus approval and debate and discussion with Council and Commission, will have to take the same sort of rough path, even if it's on a different legal basis.
I just want to comment on that. But in essence, we're saying this is an unprecedented situation, and at the end of the day, it's probably more of a political matter than a legal matter because the law doesn't provide any certainty.
I just qualify that, and I know that point has been made also by Paolo. Yes, that is true, but nobody should forget that the law and the legal basis within EU discussions, negotiations is absolutely key. And that unless a satisfactory legal basis can be found for virtually any action, it's very difficult to do it. At the end of the day, and in a way, we are much more inclined in the UK to, as it were, brush around the basic principles of law a bit. We do have to remember that within the EU, the law stemming from the treaties as a whole is actually critical. I agree the political element is vital as well, and should influence the way the law goes or the way it's interpreted. But at the end of the day, the law is critical.
So we might explore that further next week with the lawyers.
To supplement that point, we started off, or David started off, by referring to the fact that Scotland's EU membership situation would be creating a precedent, and it's not just an issue that creating uncertainty for Scotland. It's also, as a precedent, it would have implications for others in potentially a similar situation parts of existing member states who want to become independent and member states of the European Union. And I think both legally and politically, those issues would be important for the European institutions and the Council, for the European Commission, the Parliament and the Council.
Could I just ask another question?
Quickly, yeah.
Get the panel kind of comment on what particular challenges they think small states have in the European Union.
I mean, the first one that immediately comes to mind is that on any particular issue involving qualified majority voting, as the vast majority of European decisions now do, then the small state has a pretty modest supply of votes to deploy, and it's not going to be able to move forward very easily without a significant alliance. So it needs to think about its compromises almost in advance. It needs to be really very careful about that. So I mean, I think that's, for me, that's key. And also a small state, it has to have a very clear set of strategies for working within the EU. That's probably true of states of all size.
I think it's also worth thinking that I think the small states that are most effective have a very, very clear idea of where they fit in as a small state, with which set of small states and which set of strategies they want to pursue. I think Paolo's got more on that. That's very important.
I agree. I mean, the need for allies and the need for sort of coalitions, to build coalitions, is very important in a sense. Again, I would emphasize that I don't think sort of small states, they are necessarily at a disadvantage. With a union of 28, even the large member states, they cannot act by themselves. Especially now, there is a lot of emphasis, for example, at the moment on how Germany sort of dictates. But this is sort of when there are new situations outside the normal framework of how the EU operates. In those areas, then even a country like Germany or France, they still need to find allies and build coalitions and so on. So being sort of pivotal, so being able to change the shape of a coalition from a losing one to a winning one, that's very important. That's where you want to be. But again, to be pivotal, you need to be at the heart of things rather than be semi-detached.
Okay, I've got Gavin next. Gavin.
Thank you. I take on board the point, Mr. Crawley, that regardless of the route, much of the substance of the process may not be dissimilar. But I'm interested to know, just from each panellist, based on your knowledge, experience of the legal and political situation, which route seems to you to be more likely to be the one that will happen in a central scenario? Is it the ordinary revision procedure of Article 48, or is it more likely to be the accession procedure of Article 49? I mean, Mr. Colesworth, to an extent, you've said on balance, I think you felt Article 49 was more likely, but I don't know if other panellists have views on that.
Can I just clarify
Sure.
what I meant? I was answering the question, where was the balance of opinion now on what the route should be? And I think it probably is Article 49, given what Barroso has said and what others have said, and the idea that Spain is not going to kind of cut any slack in this whole process. What's more likely? If you pushed me, I'd probably have to say I still thought it probably would end up by Article 49, but it really does depend on the initial negotiations on legal basis and process. I think David Edwards' views on this will be very interesting. It's a bit of a get-out, but there you go.
Other panellists take the contrary view.
Again, I think the lawyers will come up with a compromise, and it may be that we have an Article 49 that looks more like a 48 when it's in practice, and that is the reality of how much of it will be negotiated.
I mean, it seems to me that there is a bit of a game being played because, of course, a number of nationalist parties across Europe want to use the argument of we can be directly independent member states of the European Union to shift the politics of independence within those respective states. And now the European institutions don't want troubles as much as possible. So then the line of saying warning them, no, if you leave, you'll be outside, I think is played up precisely to that effect. And I'm not entirely sure, that is actually what it would. So the view that would prevail if the situation actually presents itself. And as I mentioned before, I think the Article 48 it seems to me, on balance, probably the more realistic. It seems to me, but I mean, for a purely, as far as I understand it, for a purely legal position of traditional international law, then Scotland would be an independent state. The rest of the UK would be the successor state, inheriting all the membership obligation and so on. So Scotland would find itself outside the EU. But then the EU is a new legal framework with its own particular rules and political sort of values and so on. So again, there's a bit of sitting on the fence, but I think on balance probably the other one.
I mean, from what I've heard, I would agree with David that Article 49 is more likely, but with arrangements, transition arrangements and so on, that would tide Scotland over until the requirements of Article 49 had been fulfilled.
Just to pick up on that point, because I've always found Europe to be a very practical organisation as well. They look at from a very pragmatic point of view. And although we're talking about the rights of Scottish citizens within the EU, we have to also be very mindful of the rights of EU citizens in Scotland and what their status would be. And I'd find it extraordinary that they would find themselves, with no rights in independent Scotland. That would be extraordinary, I think. So I think just as a continuation of that point, the pragmatism of Europe is probably a key element to how this will go as well.
I think that is where, at some stage in this whole process, the emphasis will have to turn to constructive interim arrangements of one sort or another, which is what I think we've all hinted at in one way.
Yep.
I mean, you started off by talking about the innovativeness of the European Union, and I think that would apply. I think the political factors mean that there is quite a lot of scope for mischief making. That a number of member states have an interest in not making it seem smooth and an easy process. So that would prolong certain aspects, possibly, of the negotiations. But I think there would have to be some bridge, some interim arrangements for the reasons that you've alluded to.
Thank you. I've got Hansal and then a final question from Willie because we're running over time.
I have to say that the panel today has opened my thinking a lot more, and David in particular, I think you've hit it on the nail that there is a lot of risk in a lot of areas that we will have to face. And this idea and this notion that we are going to be thrown out of the European Union as citizens is alien to me, because you're either a member of the European Union or you're not. And in the absence of an agreement with Scotland and the European Union, we are definitely out. And it'll be our choice rather than the European Union's choice. However, that said, I think what is now actually added to my concerns is the fact that there is a strong possibility that some of the European Union members will wish to take advantage of our re-entry in terms of trade, fisheries in particular. The Spanish friends will want to make sure that historically we've had all sorts of seesawing between our fishery rights and their fishery rights, and I think that's something that we need to be very careful about. So I think that's concerning me. But what I'm wondering is, despite all the risks and despite the dangers of our industry, and despite the fact that it may take longer than what we are expecting, is there any hope of an earlier agreement of some sort to protect all of this status quo, or as you yourself have indicated, that there may be some mischief making in the sense that people may well try to take advantage of that issue from us?
I suspect the consensus of this panel, and they will disagree with me if they don't, is that there ought to be a set of interim arrangements agreed at some stage in this process, which one would hope would protect rights. We don't know that, there are no guarantees, and there are risks, but that is what we would hope.
I think, in fact, it's very rare to be an EU member or not. There are so many different relationships between EU member states, non-member states, nearly member states, wannabe member states, and the EU itself, that in practice there are many, many different varieties of ensuring rights and relationships with the European Union. And I think it would be surprising that it would be in the interest of anybody to throw everything up immediately and not to seek to find some kind of working relationship that could work in the interim.
It's helpful.
Final question from Willie Coffey, and if you can make it quick, please.
Sorry. Thanks very much, Convener. It was just on the issue about ramping up expertise in Scotland that was touched on just slightly earlier there. When Scotland becomes independent, we need to ramp up the expertise. And I think, Mr Crawley, you were talking a little bit about that kind of assumes that the expertise at the moment is in the UK and is exercised in our behalf, in Scotland's behalf. Do you think that that expertise has been good for Scotland in the past period of membership of the European Union as part of the United Kingdom? And I'm thinking particularly about CAP reforms, where I think it's fair and clear to see that Scotland has one of the worst deals in terms of CAP reform negotiations that we've ever seen. So, is that expertise, do you think, properly deployed in Scotland's best interest over the past period, would you say?
Quite difficult for me to say that it hadn't, in the sense that I've been involved in fisheries negotiations and UK-level negotiations and common agricultural policy negotiations in the 2000s and 2003, that kind of period for agriculture, and going back to 77, 81 for fisheries. I'm happy to say this, as I am no longer a civil servant. I'm not really in a position to comment on how well arrangements have gone certainly since 2006, when I left the civil service. I do think that in general there was a very, very good and understanding exchange of expertise between Whitehall experts and Scottish experts. I'm not looking at it below the political level, where of course there have been issues over the years under the different constitutional relationships. Experts have, in general, worked together very, very well, and in some areas, and I would not exclude agriculture and fisheries from those, they have worked together extremely well. It doesn't mean to say that the political outcomes have been exactly what both parties have wanted. I mean, the view that I would take in relation to agricultural negotiations generally is that as the UK has in effect achieved more than might otherwise have been the case. For a number of years now, the UK Treasury has sought to reduce the costs of the common agricultural policy, which as a major net contributor is hardly a surprise, but that Scotland, partly because of the rope that it's been allowed to have in Brussels since 1997, and certainly in relation to the 2002-3 CAP negotiations, was actually able to deliver a rather better deal working with the UK and in a number of informal alliances with other member states than might otherwise have been the case. But, you know, you can look at this in a number of different ways, and I quite understand why you would. But I think as far as expertise is concerned, UK expertise across the board has been absolutely vital to Scotland's position across a whole range of areas. And there's no question but that Scotland would have to build up a lot of that expertise or buy it in or whatever were it to become independent.
Specific point about the current allocation in CAP, where we're getting the lowest per hectare in the whole of the European Union, is that a good deal?
I don't think I can really answer that, quite honestly. I've looked a little bit at that. Deal, and the issues are around historical ones, and I think you really need to have CAP experts from both sides to give you a decent answer.
For a public representative like me that sees someone saying expertise is deployed to the best effect on our behalf, then we get the worst deal possible. That doesn't square.
Any quick final comments from the rest of the panel? No. Can I thank you very, very much for coming along this morning? You'll know that the inquiry is ongoing for the next few weeks and months, and we really appreciate your evidence and coming along to committee this morning. Thank you. Yeah, I'll suspend quickly for a few minutes to allow changeover of witnesses and a short comfort break. Welcome back to the European and External Relations Committee. We're moving on to our second panel of this morning on our inquiry on the Scotland's place in Europe. I'm delighted to welcome along today Marius Vahl, who is a Senior Officer to the Standing and Joint Committee and EEA Council, and Johanna Jonsdottir is the Officer Services Capital Persons and Programmes Division, European Free Trade Association. Welcome both of you to committee. I hope you managed to hear some of the earlier evidence that we had from the panel before you. We're very keen to hear your evidence today, and I believe both of you have a brief statement to make to put your organisation into context for the committee, yeah? Yeah. Marius.
Yes, well, yeah, we'll say a few words. Just thought we would kind of introduce both ourselves, say a little bit where we're from and what it is that we do at EFTA. So Johanna and me, we're both officers, basically civil servants at the Secretariat of the EFTA in Brussels, European Free Trade Association. And the Secretariat assists 3 of the EFTA states. We're calling them the EEA EFTA states because one of EFTA's members, Switzerland, is not party to the EEA agreement. So we assist them in the day-to-day management of this agreement on the European Economic Area, whereby these 3 countries are essentially part of the single market of the European Union. So Johanna is Icelandic, I am Norwegian. We're not here representing either Iceland and Norway, but all of our member states and EFTA as a whole. And of course we are civil servants. We're not as free to speak as these former civil servants or academics. So there's certain limits to what kind of answers we can give. So you have to be clever in how you ask your questions, and then you have to read between the lines afterwards. And I thought we could just quickly also say a little bit about what our particular roles. So, as the convener mentioned, I'm secretary to the EFTA Standing Committee, the EEA Joint Committee, and the EEA Council. I'll just maybe explain a little bit what these are. The Joint Committee is a committee of senior officials from both these 3 EEA EFTA states and from the EU. And this is the main decision-making body in the EEA. So this is the place where, and the main decisions means new EU legislation, single market legislation, is then being incorporated or made part of the agreement. And that takes place in this joint committee. The EFTA Standing Committee is basically the organ on the EFTA side to coordinate the position of the 3 EEA EFTA states in the joint committee. So it usually takes place just before, because the way it operates is that all of these 3 EEA EFTA states, they speak with one voice in our meeting. So it's the EU on the one side and the 3 EEA EFTA states, so they have to coordinate their position. And finally, I'm also secretary or co-secretary with a counterpart on the EU side to the EEA Council, which is the political overarching meetings at the ministerial level. They meet a bit less frequently, twice a year, whereas the joint committee meets almost monthly. And so that's what I do. I might also mention that well, I've only been at EFTA now for 2 weeks, but I used to be there I've been there. I spent a year working for the European Commission. Before that, I was also at EFTA doing the same job. So, and before that, again, I worked in a think tank in Brussels, where I worked on the EU neighbourhood policy, including relations with the EFTA states. I thought I would let Johanna introduce herself.
Yes, thank you. As the convener mentioned, I'm an officer in the Services, Capital Persons and Programmes Division of EFTA. This is one of our 2 substance divisions. The other one is the goods division, so a slightly shorter name than ours. But they reflect sort of because the EEA agreement allows the EFTA states to participate in the internal market, which includes the 4 freedoms, and as well as various horizontal areas. So my particular, I have 3 working groups. One of them is on the free movement of persons, employment and social policy. Another one is on health and safety at work and labour law. And the third is on gender equality and anti-discrimination. And each of these working groups is made up of civil servants from the EA-EFTA states. Switzerland is also usually an observer in our working groups, even though they're not part of the EEA. They are members of EFTA, of course. These groups meet about twice a year in Brussels, where we discuss various issues that are on the EU's agenda, mainly proposals and things that will be turned into legislation, which will then be incorporated into the EEA agreement. So at our meetings, we invite people from the Commission to attend to discuss these things with us. We invite often people from the Secretariat of the relevant committee of the European Parliament, and often also councillors from the country which is in the presidency of the EU. Of course, in addition to the meetings, we have regular email exchanges and so on EU legislation and initiatives that are coming up. So in the working groups, experts from the EA-EFTA states follow very closely EU proposals which are in the pipelines and which will later be adopted by the EU institutions. Another thing that our experts in the working groups do is they often attend meetings of expert groups and comitology committees in the Commission, which we have access to through the EA agreement. But of course, there is no formal access to the Council or the Parliament. So these informal exchanges at our working group meetings are one way that we use to find out what's happening and also to get our positions across. Once an act is adopted by the EU, the working groups, the experts in the working groups are in charge of scrutinizing them and saying whether they agree whether or not the act is EEA relevant, and also whether the EA-EFTA states need any technical or any other adaptations to the act, and whether they have so-called constitutional requirements, meaning that whether once the act is incorporated into the EA agreement, the national parliaments will also have to take a formal decision on the entry into force of the act. Yeah, so that's basically what my role involves at the EFTA Secretariat. And then, of course, a decision, as Marius said, is later taken in the joint committee about whether or not to incorporate an act into the EA agreement. This is what I do is at expert level, and then this is at diplomatic level.
Thank you very much. That puts, in context for us at this committee, and I know that you mentioned a few areas where you definitely have some input, and there's areas where you don't have some input. And it was really, I think, my first question is about the acquis, and what parts of that, what proportion of that, what areas of it are covered by what you do, and maybe the areas that aren't. Yeah. Sorry.
You can start.
Yeah, well, the EEA. So if I understand correctly, the question: how far does the EEA agreement cover the entire EU acquis? Yeah. Well, Marius and I were actually just discussing this morning because it's quite difficult to measure the entire proportion. There was a counting project done at the EFTA Secretariat a couple of years ago, where, if I remember correctly, it was concluded that there were about 5,000 acts in force in the EEA and 15,000 in the EU. So that would lead one to the conclusion, perhaps, that it was about 1/3 of the entire EU acquis. But as we were discussing this morning, this is actually could be quite misleading, because one act, the Services Directive, for example, is not the equivalent of some technical regulation about a standard. So it's actually very difficult to assess this. Another way to sort of draw conclusions about what proportion of EU acquis is covered by the EEA agreement is to look at the recent accession negotiations of Iceland with the EU. There, I think there were just over 30 chapters in total which were being negotiated, and the EU estimated that I think it was 11 of these. I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, but I think it was about 1/3 of these chapters was fully covered by the EEA agreement and had fully been applied in Iceland. Another third had been partly applied, and then another third which had not been applied at all. Although I should mention that there are other agreements such as Schengen, which is not covered by the EEA, which, but EEA is by far the most extensive agreement. So yeah, that would lead one to draw the conclusion that it was about two-thirds, at one half to two-thirds of the EU, body of EU legislation, which was covered by the EA. Of course, the most substantial areas which are not covered are the Common Agricultural Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, the Monetary Union.
Sorry.
Yeah, I can just add one thing. I mean, in Norway, this has been discussed quite a lot, and there was the government set down an independent review of of Norway's relationship with the EU, focusing not just on the EA, which published its report about 2 years ago, 900 pages. And they concluded that Norway had incorporated approximately 3/4 of all of the EU legislation into its national law, rules and standards, because Norway has about 70-odd agreements with the European Union. The EA is just one of them, by far the most important, but there are also Schengen, Dublin on foreign policy, separate agreements on trade and agriculture, etc., etc. And so that's what they concluded. But again, we agree a lot. It's very, I mean, you're really apples and oranges or peas and watermelons. I don't know, but it's really very difficult. The technical veterinary standards, which are changed almost on a weekly basis, and you compare it to something like the Directive of Free Movement of Persons, which has an impact on all citizens across, I mean, 500 million people, or she mentioned the Services Directive. So we'll be very cautious in drawing kind of too strong conclusions on the basis of that. Yes, it's an indicator, but there are more interpretation needed.
Thank you. Open to questions from colleagues. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I know that you heard some of the deliberations in the previous panel, and one of the themes that came out was a divergence of priorities for the UK government as opposed to Scotland. And I think one of those areas would be migration for me, in the fact that Scotland is the demographics show that we need to build our population. So I was wondering if you could explain in a bit more detail what membership of the EEA means in terms of free movement of workers.
Yes, this is one of the areas I deal with, and I actually quite regularly get queries on this from members of the British public asking whether the UK would still have to apply the EU acquis on free movement of persons if they were to leave the EU and join EFTA and become members of the EEA in that way. And the answer is that the EFTA states apply the EU acquis on free movement of persons, most significantly Directive 2004/38 on the free movement, on the right of citizens of the Union and their family members to move and reside anywhere in the Union, and also Regulation 492 2011 on the right of free movement of workers. So those two acts are both in force in the EEA, although Liechtenstein has certain sectoral adaptations due to its extremely small size and geographical position.
Morning, panel. Could you just comment in terms of any difficulties that arise from the inability of EFTA states to engage with the European Parliament or the Council directly, or in practice, is that not such a big deal?
I can start with that. Well, I think it is generally recognized that this is is the biggest challenge of being in the EEA. I mean, you get the benefits economically, socially of being part of the single market, but you do not have a political voice. There are lots of little mechanisms and systems in place to allow for some participation and some consultation, but the bottom line is that our member states do not have any MEPs, and they have no vote in the Council, and they do not participate in its deliberations either. Of course, I mean, being in those meetings, of course, this is a process that is a continuous, and a lot of things happen outside as well. But there you're in the acting more like a lobbyist is the way of dealing with this, and they're trying to participate. They participate, for instance, in informal council meetings. I know Norway now has appointed people to be like national experts who can work in the administration of the European Parliament. So they're spending a lot of, Norwegian ministers and and I guess Icelandic ministers, but even more Norwegian ministers and deputy ministers, they are in Brussels almost continuously trying to have meetings with the commissioners or in the parliament to. But that is it is the major drawback. Everybody recognizes that. It's, yeah, I think that's quite clear.
Yes, I don't have much to add to that. There are, of course, informal channels, and at our working group meetings, we do invite members from the Irish presidency and so on. We also have a mechanism called EEA EFTA Comments, which happens, as I mentioned, we have a formal access to the Commission, committees and expert groups when new proposals are being drawn up. Once the proposal is out there, we don't have any formal access to the Council and the Parliament, as Marius said. Then one way the EEA-EFTA states use to get their views across is to submit EEA-EFTA comments to the EU. It's basically just what the name says. We write down the EEA-EFTA state's position and we send it to the country which is in the presidency, usually the rapporteur in the European Parliament on the relevant proposal, and a few other people who are interested, who we think might listen. But of course, it's entirely up to them whether they take our views into account.
Thank you. I mean, just following up on, I think what was a good question from Mr. Campbell. I think you mentioned that the main balance of attempting to wield influence is informal. I think you used the word lobbying. Can you just, you touched on one or two of them, maybe more formal mechanisms. Can you maybe just expand on those? What are the main formal structured mechanisms for wielding influence, or have you sort of told us about all of them already? Are there other ones specific that are structured that you've not mentioned?
First, of course, you have the formal meetings, the EEA Joint Committee and the EEA, the Council, which is the political arena. So, that is an arena of what can be used, but in practice, it doesn't really work that or function that like that, because our counterpart is the European External Action Service, and they are not really involved in the development of the various rules and regulations of the single market. So that is one formal channel. Another one, there are several in the EEA agreement. It provides for a lot of consultation mechanisms, which that occurs mainly at the technical level. So participation in the Commission working groups that is developing legislation. Icelandic, Liechtenstein, and Norwegian representatives would also be there, where they can contribute with their expertise, but of course they do not have a vote. If the matters come to a vote, very often in these Commission working groups, it's worked on a kind of a consensual basis in practice when they're developing this. But of course, they always know that there are no red lines as far as the three EEA-EFTA states are concerned. And the same goes for the committees that develop the various programs, the research programs, annual work program, these kind of things, where they also participate. So these are the main formal channels, and then we also have these kind of informal arrangements whereby our ministers are invited to attend informal council meetings. During each presidency, you usually have one or two of each of the various configurations, and our ministers are allowed to participate and speak in these. Of course, they don't make decisions, they don't adopt decisions, but they are involved there as well. And then, of course, there are the bilateral meetings, which is probably, the most important ones. I don't know, I don't have a number for how many times our ministers have meetings with their EU counterparts, either in one of the 28 member states or in Brussels, but it is very, very frequent. I know we have several ministers in Brussels per week, and they also travel around Europe to all the capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, regularly as well. So, but this is, I think I've covered it. I could also mention, we also have this arrangement of national experts, whereas our civil servants work for more similar to British and French civil servants, are seconded to work in the EU institutions, primarily in the Commission, for a short period, which is what I was last year. where you work just as if you're a functionary of the institution, and of course you work then for the EU institutions and not for your member country, but everybody knows that you are used as a channel of information and as well. So I think Norway has about 50 of those, but that is the civil servant at desk officer level. So in terms of actually shaping the legislation, it's quite limited. Did I cover everything, you think?
Yes, I think so.
No, there's quite a lot.
Yeah. In terms of the formal channels, yes. I mean, one informal channel I might mention is the Nordic cooperation, because of course Iceland and Norway both belong to the Nordic cooperation, the Nordic Council, and so on. And there are, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark are there as well, that are members of the EU. So I think that's one informal way as well that the EAFTA states use to maybe try to put across their views or get some information.
Thank you. Patricia Ferguson.
I was trying to think last night what the possibilities of this might be, because the question I would want to ask is, are there any other countries negotiating with EFTA at the moment in terms of membership? But I was trying to think how many countries there were left in Europe that weren't already either members of EFTA, full members of the EU, or accession countries. But are there any negotiations going on? No. Okay.
No, I mean, the latest new member we had was Liechtenstein in 1991, and that was a bit special because it has a customs union and a monetary union with Switzerland. So it was almost part of it already. So there hasn't been any change in our membership since 1995, when 3 of our members left to join the European Union. There have been discussions very informally of some of the very small states in Europe, of whether or not that has been discussed also on the EU side, countries like Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, whether or not this could be a possible option. But they concluded, kind of had a review of this over the last few years, and now they conclude basically that the EA is not really an option, mainly because the EFTA isn't particularly looking for new members as such. But I mean, EFTA as an organization is open to any state who wants to join. So, but we don't have any applications, and we haven't had any processes for some time. Yeah.
You mentioned small states, and it's sometimes suggested that EFTA EEA is best suited to smaller states. What would your view on that be? Or is it the democratic deficit issue that would be the one that would persuade most countries, do you think, to become involved? Sorry, that might be too political.
Yeah, no. Well, we could remind ourselves that EFTA was established by the United Kingdom, was a key country behind that. And of course, one thing is EFTA, another thing is being part of the EEA. I mean, EFTA does other things as well. I mean, we basically have 3 main tasks, and the EEA is one of them. Our internal relations is another, free trade among our member states, but that is a very small task because we've had free trade for more than 30 years now. And the third big task is that the EFTA countries negotiate trade agreements with countries across the globe together, because they become a more interesting partner and get a bit more weight in trade negotiations, and have agreements with, I think it's about 35 countries right now, and then they're negotiating, continue to negotiate a lot. So whether in the EEA, big country, small country, I mean, yeah, as you say, it's a very political, but I mean, we had bigger countries. In the first year of the EEA, of course, we had some slightly bigger countries. Sweden, Austria, and Finland were also on the EFTA side in the EEA. No, I don't think it's something that you can really say that it's for small countries or for big countries, really. It's just by accident of history that it has ended up with the 4 countries it has now.
Could I ask you, how does public policy develop in the 4 EFTA states? When you look at the European Union and the MAF agreement and so on that affects the budget every so often, that has clear impacts on countries like Scotland, for example. And this committee, on previous occasions, has been looking at things like IT infrastructure. and how that can be developed across Europe in harmony and so on and so forth. When you see things like that taking place, either improving or being cut, how does that impact on the EFTA countries and perhaps their attitude to things like IT infrastructure in their own countries? Do you follow what happens within the European Union, or do you operate completely independently of that, you know, in disregard to it? How does it affect you?
I mean, I do think the EFTA states would follow that kind of thing. If they're
broadband, for example, investment in broadband technology right across countries for cities and for rural populations. The European Union may or may not invest more or less money in that. Do the EFTA countries kind of follow that to try to be part of that development process, or do they retain their own approach to it entirely?
Well, I mean, on that particular question, I mean, you're talking of more generally on public policy, big European projects, in broadband across Europe being one. I mean, you could imagine lots of other areas. Very often this will be directly relevant, what we call EEA relevant. So this is something that you would usually either do this with pay for this through EU programs, or will somehow be involving European rules and regulations, which will then be directly applicable to us as well through the EEA agreement. So very often we would be part of these projects, more or less like a member state. Very often, but that is which is a bit a peculiar position for us. Is, I mean, from a UK perspective, if it's EU, it's EU, and then that's quite clear that you are in, so to say. But for us, we will always have to make an assessment of whether or not it should actually is something that is part of the EEA agreement or not, and whereby we would be part of these projects, or if it falls outside. And then, of course, for the decision makers is a question, is that then something we would like to be part of? And then they might then, if the answer is yes, then they might conclude some sort of a separate arrangements. And that happens. This is how the policy making process when it comes to the European affairs is in all of our countries. And that's why, I mean, very often, or quite often, you see that, yes, it's inside, and then we're part of it through the EA agreement, or otherwise we conclude a separate agreement. And Norway now has, I think they're getting 70, I don't remember the precise number, but they have about 75 agreements with the European Union, covering basically every area of public policy. So if it falls outside, I mean, in general, I think all of our countries are very keen on participating in European integration as such. It is just that the question of membership has become, I mean, the population are against, both now in Iceland and in Norway. That's just the way it is, but in general, we want to be part of the European integration process, and then becomes the technical issue when a question like the one you are raising, well, precisely how do you locate it in our institutional and contractual arrangement? Does it fall within the EEA or not, or do you have to conclude something separately? But I think in general they always say they want to participate. It's a general rule.
I mean, I think that's part of the reason why the EEA agreement works, is that most of the legislation and policies that are coming out of the EU, which need to then be adopted in the EAFTA states, well, the EAFTA states consider them to be either beneficial or benign, I guess. So I think that's, you know, a big part of the reason why it works, particularly without any representation in the decision-making institutions.
On the balance, of course, the 4 member states in EFTA clearly think their interests are better served outside the European Union, but there is clearly a high level of integration and cooperation and so on and so forth, and they feel that that's the best balance for the members of EFTA. So they seem to have a view that they can have, well, I don't know about influence. Gavin Brown mentioned it and spoke about influence and political influence, but it's more of lobbying and that kind of influence. So that seems to be a balance that suits the 4 members, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway and Switzerland, is it?
Yeah. Switzerland is not in the EEA, they have their separate type of arrangements.
Okay. Okay, very interesting.
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, the population are against. But if you're asking in our national parliaments and in our political parties, the position is quite different. They're in favor of membership, most of them. So I know in the Norwegian Parliament, of the 7 parties there, I mean, if you count the MPs, they would have a majority in favor of membership still. Whereas if you're looking at opinion polls right now in Norway, it's 70% against. And it has always been like that. I mean, since before I was born.
That's actually not quite the same situation
in Iceland.
In Iceland.
No.
In Iceland at the moment, there's a clear majority in the parliament against EU membership.
Public as well.
And in the public, it depends what question you ask. We've heard about that this morning as well in these opinion polls. But I think currently, because the previous government, which came to power at the sort of height of the economic crisis, they were in favour of EU membership and decided to launch an application, which has now been frozen by the new government, which came into power in the spring of 2013. So now there's a clear majority in opposing EU membership. But if you ask the population whether they would like to continue the accession negotiations, you have a majority in favour. If you ask whether they would like to join the EU, usually you don't get a majority in favour, but it varies a bit.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Does EFTA make any financial contribution to the EU? Yeah, you do.
Yes, through the EEA agreement, but not as part of they make a contribution. So that's the 3 EEA EFTA states. There you have a financial mechanism, the EEA financial mechanism, which is for 5 years at a time, and which has been growing quite significantly. And I've been looking, and there's also this peculiarity now of the current period, which ends in a few months, the current 5-year period, where Norway contributes. They have their own, there are 2 mechanisms. One is the EEA financial mechanism, another one is the Norway mechanism. So in effect, Norway pays more than Liechtenstein and Iceland in per capita terms. And also, by the way, Switzerland also have their own contributions that they make, which is a separate agreement and, that they have with the European Union. And if I'm looking at, just trying to remember the figures. If you look at how the annual contribution, net annual contribution in per capita terms, which I think is the most interesting figure, you see that in the Swiss case, it's roughly 25 euros per person per year, or per inhabitant per year. In the case of Iceland and Liechtenstein, it's about 40, and in the case of Norway, it's about 70 euros. And I think the biggest net contributors of the EU member states, they have slightly more than that, around 100 and a bit. Whereas UK, if I remember, I'm not sure if I have the latest figures, but I think it's quite comparable to what Norway is contributing. Might be slightly less. So yes, but these are voluntary contributions which are not mandated by the agreement as such. Speak formally.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. You mentioned the European External Engagement Service, I think, in you speaking with us, and I would just like to try and understand a little bit about how some of the EU priorities affect you or not as members of EFTA, and I'm thinking specifically an area that this committee has taken evidence on in human trafficking, on the position on human trafficking across Europe, and what, if any, influence that has on you as members of EFTA.
Well, this is not part of the EEA agreement, so this is not something we officially deal with at EFTA. As far as it relates to Schengen, however, the EEA EFTA states do have a Schengen association agreement with the EU, and So they would be participants in those actions as far as they relate to the border-free Schengen zone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, just to make the point that these agreements they have on Schengen, on Dublin, and all things, these are bilateral agreements between each of the EFTA. So it's not really anything to do with EFTA.
No,
right.
No.
So this is Iceland has a bilateral agreement with the European Union. Norway has the same. Liechtenstein has the same. But they're all in Schengen and all in Dublin by now. So it will be handled in that context.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got a final question from Rod Campbell.
Johanna, I appreciate you might find this difficult to answer, but are there any kind of general lessons that you can share with us about Iceland's discussions to join the European Union? Anything that could be learned from the discussions which have taken place about the process?
Well, I mean, I guess I can tell you, as Marius said, we're not here as representatives of Iceland or Norway, and but I guess I can tell you a little bit about what happened in Iceland. As you know, the entire banking sector collapsed in the autumn of 2008. In the wake of that, there was the government that was in power at the time collapsed, and a new government took over. And I think there was, I mean, this was quite an extreme period in Iceland's history. Another thing that happened in addition to the collapse of the banking sector was that the currency was devalued quite substantially. I think the Icelandic krona is the smallest independent currency in the world, and so it can easily be devalued, and in a crisis such as this it was very substantially devalued. So I think there was at that time a very substantial sort of movement in favor of joining the EU, and in particularly the Eurozone. So the government that came to power launched an application process and began the accession talks, and in fact actually I think closed quite a few number of the chapters before then a new government was elected who opposed EU membership. But at the same time, what happened in the EU, of course, was the financial crisis has impacted a lot of the EU member states. At the same time, the Icelandic economy sort of stabilized. So I think during that period, maybe the public debate sort of moved a little bit away from EU membership just because of the economic situation within the EU and some of the EU states, and at the same time the recovery in Iceland. Of course, in Iceland there are lots traditionally speaking, there have been lots of reasons that have been named why Iceland would be Eurosceptic. Practical reasons such as the common fisheries policy mainly, but also more historical reasons. I mean, due to Iceland's geographical location, for example, it's quite isolated from the rest of Europe. It has traditionally had quite close ties with the United States, and there are various reasons that can be named for the reason that Iceland has, or at least particular sectors of the population have been quite Eurosceptic. I think, at the moment, Iceland is still formally considered a candidate country, if I understand correctly, but the current government is not in favor of EU membership and has frozen the negotiations process.
Thank you.
Marius, I was very impressed with your command of the figures of your contribution to the EU.
Just check them.
It's comfy, so I can see that. I was wondering about what the benefit, financial or otherwise, of being a member of the free trade area, for instance, is. What sort of a financial benefit is that given the EFTA associated countries?
That is a very good question. It is a very difficult, if you try to ask an economist of the benefits of being part of the single market. There is, you have the same discussion here in the UK and everywhere. Everybody agrees that this is, if you ask economic operators, both employees and employers organizations, they will all agree that it is very beneficial. Putting a number to it is extremely difficult. I mean, how do you make that assessment? They tried in this Norwegian independent review to try to look at 20 years of participation in the single market, how is it contributed to the Norwegian economy? Of course, the Norwegian economy has gone extremely well in the last 20 years. And then the big question is how much of this can be attributed to the single market. And they didn't really have a kind of a numerical answer to it, because it's, analytically it's just so extremely important difficult to make that assessment. But they were very clear that there had been a big benefit. The closest thing we ever got to a serious analysis has been done by the European Union itself, by the Commission in connection with the 10-year anniversary of the single market. So it's starting to become a bit old, and where they were trying to make an assessment of how much has this contributed to GDP growth in Europe. And I think they concluded about 2% at the time, but that's quite some time ago. There isn't a clear, it's just too difficult to make that assessment. All sectors of the economy, and what is really the alternative, what would have happened if you did not have this? How do you make that assessment of these thousands of pieces of legislation and how they impact on, 500 million consumers or 100 million of companies? I think it's just a very difficult task, and I've never really seen a very good analysis of this. But the official independent inquiry into this, they were concluded that it was very beneficial and very important to the Norwegian economy, which of course is very export-oriented, like Iceland and like Liechtenstein. They're all very small, open economies in a world and a continent increasingly integrated. There isn't really much debate about whether or not being integrated with Europe is beneficial or not. It is, but then the question is precisely how much and how do you balance it against other public policy goals. But being part of it, I don't even amongst opponents of both the EU membership and the EEA, they recognize that you need something.
Okay, sorry for making that a difficult last question. We have to move on with our deliberations this morning at our committee. Can I thank you very much for coming along? I think give us an insight into the EEA and EFTA and the work that you do, and certainly we're continuing this inquiry for some weeks in the future. So we'll take into account your evidence.
Thank you very much for your invitation, and you know how to reach us if you have any further questions.
Thank you. Yes, thank you thank you very much. Okay. That's not right, is it? Okay, very quickly moving on to agenda item 2 is a report from the Scottish Government on the transposition of current EU directives. There's quite a detailed table in the paper that you have. I think this committee keeps a wee eye on specific directives that are being transposed and how they're going. If there's any comments or questions from colleagues? No, happy to note the report for future reference. Okay, and we'll look forward to the next update. Thank you very much. And moving on to agenda item 3, which we had agreed to take in private, so I'll suspend for a few minutes to allow the committee to go into private session.